Between 1847 and 1851, 9 plantation owners across central Alabama died in their beds, each with the same horrifying injuries: crushed windpipes, no evidence of a struggle, and a single detail that sent chills through every slaveholder in the region: their bedroom doors were locked from the inside. These men collectively owned more than 400 enslaved people, but investigators noticed something odd in each estate's records. Every one of them had recently acquired an unusually tall field hand, listed in the ledgers only as Jacob. No surname, no age, just Jacob. And here's what never made it into the official reports: 7 of the 9 victims had their tongues cut out after death and placed in their own hands. The other 2 were found with their mouths stuffed full of raw cotton, still attached to the bowl. Local newspapers called it a plague of nighttime seizures, but the planters knew better. They knew someone was coming for them, and they had no way to stop it. The investigation would eventually involve 3 sheriffs, 2 federal marshals, and more than 60 armed vigilantes. Yet not a single arrest was ever made. What they uncovered forced them to face a truth more terrifying than anything they'd imagined. Central Alabama in the decade before the Civil War was a place where cotton ruled, and people were treated as property. The rich black soil produced some of the South's finest cotton, and the men who owned that land wielded power that reached far beyond their property lines. They sat in state legislatures, controlled county courts, and decided who prospered and who suffered with a word. The plantation belt from Montgomery to Selma was dotted with grand estates, each a small kingdom. Men like Cornelius Vaughn, Thaddeus Reinhardt, and Josiah Grantham didn't just own land and slaves. They owned the very infrastructure of the region. But in the summer of 1847, something changed. A man appeared at slave auctions and private sales throughout the region. A man so tall he was described as standing between 6'9" and 7'2", with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to pass through a doorway. His skin was described as dark mahogany, his hands the size of dinner plates, and his eyes, this detail appears in nearly every account, were a pale, almost silvery grey. His name, according to a Savannah auction house bill of sale dated June 12, 1847, was Jacob, no last name. The document listed his age as about 28, though the auctioneer noted this was a guess as the man refused to speak. The word "mute" was underlined twice in the margin. The buyer was Cornelius Vaughn, owner of Sweet Gum Plantation, a 2,000-acre estate south of Hayneville. Vaughn paid $950 for Jacob, nearly double the going rate for a prime field hand, but considered it money well spent. A man of Jacob's size could do the work of 2, and his muteness was seen as a benefit. A slave who couldn't talk, couldn't organize, couldn't spread discontent, couldn't testify. Vaughn brought Jacob back in chains, though witnesses said the chains were more for show than necessity. Jacob walked with a strange calm, his massive frame moving with a grace that seemed at odds with his size. The other slaves watched him arrive with a mix of fear and fascination. What Vaughn didn't know was that Jacob had been sold 6 times in the previous 14 months. Each time, he was bought by a wealthy planter, each time resold within weeks, sometimes days, and each time the seller was not the original buyer, but the man's widow or surviving family. The pattern was there in the records, but scattered across 3 states and a dozen auction houses. No one had connected the dots. No one had asked why a prime field hand kept returning to market, or what happened to the men who bought him. Sweet Gum Plantation was one of the crown jewels of Lowndes County. The main house was a Greek Revival masterpiece, 6 columns across the front, built from brick fired on the property. Cornelius Vaughn lived there with his wife, their 4 children, and his mother-in-law. The family employed 3 white overseers, 2 house servants, and maintained a staff of field hands divided into 3 gangs by strength. Vaughn was 52, a second-generation planter, known as a stern but fair master by the standards of the time, which meant he used the whip less than some, but used it nonetheless. He attended church every Sunday, served on the county board, and had twice been elected to the state legislature. But among the enslaved, he was known as a breaker of spirits, a man who took satisfaction in crushing the will of anyone who showed pride or independence. He never sold families together if he could avoid it. Separating mothers from children, husbands from wives, was, in his view, the best way to prevent rebellion. Jacob was assigned to the first gang, the strongest field hands. His first week, he picked more cotton than any 3 men combined. His second week, the overseer, Randall Peake, made the mistake of assuming Jacob's silence meant submission. Peake struck Jacob across the back with a cane for moving too slowly during a water break. Jacob stopped moving entirely. He didn't cry out, he couldn't, but he turned his head and looked directly at Peake with those pale grey eyes. The look lasted 3 seconds. Then Jacob returned to work. Peake later said he felt something in that moment that made his bowels turn to water. He never struck Jacob again. The other slaves noticed things. Jacob never ate with the others. He took his ration and disappeared into the woods each evening, returning only after dark. Some whispered he was praying. Others said he was planning. A few suggested, in voices barely above a breath, on the night of September 3, 1847, exactly 83 days after Jacob arrived, Cornelius Vaughan went to bed at his usual hour. The next morning his wife found him dead. His eyes were open and bulging, his face a mottled purple-grey. His mouth was open wide, his tongue gone, severed cleanly at the root and placed in his right hand, which had been folded across his chest. His throat was crushed, the damage beneath the skin catastrophic. The pressure required, the doctor said, would have been enormous, far beyond what any normal man could apply. The bedroom door was locked from the inside. The key was still in the lock. The windows were latched. No sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication Vaughan had fought back. The bed linens were barely disturbed. Most unsettling of all was the 7 cotton bowls, still attached to bits of stem and leaf, arranged in a semicircle around his head. The investigation was perfunctory. Sheriff Thomas Braddock arrived, interviewed the family, the overseers, a handful of house slaves. Everyone had the same story, they'd heard nothing. Braddock's theory, shared with the family that afternoon, was that Cornelius had suffered a seizure, biting through his own tongue and somehow damaging his own throat in the process. It was thin reasoning, but it allowed everyone to avoid the alternative, that someone had entered a locked room and murdered one of the most powerful men in the county without making a sound. The funeral was held 3 days later. Half the county attended. The slaves from Sweet Gum were required to line the road as the procession passed, heads bowed. Jacob stood at the back, his head level with everyone else's despite being several yards behind. He did not bow his head. He watched the coffin pass with those pale grey eyes, his face expressionless, his massive hands hanging loose at his sides. 3 weeks after Vaughan's death, Margaret Vaughan sold Jacob to Thaddeus Reinhardt, owner of Fairhope Plantation in Montgomery County. The sale price was 6 udras, a loss, but Margaret wanted the giant mute slave gone. Field hands whispered that Jacob was responsible for her husband's death, though none could say how or why. Reinhardt was delighted with the purchase. He'd heard about the enormous slave who could pick cotton like a machine. He put Jacob to work immediately, where the man again outperformed every other slave. Reinhardt was a harsh master, quick with the whip and quick to punish. Jacob worked without complaint, his silence making him the perfect target for Reinhardt's cruelty. The old man enjoyed ordering the giant to perform demeaning tasks, making him kneel, forcing him to bow, striking him for imagined offenses. On the evening of October 27, 1847, Reinhardt went to bed alone. The next morning his son found him dead. The scene was identical. Crushed throat, locked door, no sign of struggle. This time Reinhardt's mouth was stuffed full of raw cotton, so much that his cheeks bulged. Cotton fibers were found deep in his throat, but suffocation was not the cause of death. The throat had been crushed first. This time the news spread faster. Within days, every planter in central Alabama had heard about the 2 deaths and their disturbing similarities. Sheriff Braddock traveled to Fairhope to investigate, and it was during this investigation that someone finally made the connection. Both men had owned a slave named Jacob. Both had died within weeks of acquiring him. And according to the bill of sale, Jacob had been purchased from the widow of Cornelius Vaughan. Braddock ordered Jacob to be found and questioned. But when the overseer went to the slave quarters that evening, Jacob was gone. His sleeping space was empty. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard him go. He had simply vanished. A search party was organized. 20 armed men with dogs combed the woods and fields for 3 days. They found nothing. No tracks, no trace, no sign of which direction Jacob had fled. But Braddock was thorough, and something about the case nagged at him. If Jacob was the killer, why had he been sold? Why had Vaughan's widow let a murderer slip through her fingers? Braddock began to dig into Jacob's history, requesting information from auction houses and plantation records across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Jacob had been sold 9 times in the previous 18 months. In 8 of those 9 cases, the buyer had died within 12 weeks of the purchase. The only exception was a small farmer in Georgia who had bought Jacob but sold him 2 weeks later, claiming the slave made him uncomfortable. The farmer was still alive. 8 dead men, 8 identical causes of death, scattered across a wide area. 8 locked rooms, 8 crushed throats, and in 7 of those cases, some form of mutilation involving the tongue or mouth. Braddock compiled his findings into a report and sent it to the governor's office, urging immediate action. He described Jacob in detail, the unusual height, the pale grey eyes, the absolute silence, and warned that the man was likely still in Alabama, probably still killing. The response from Montgomery was swift: find Jacob and hang him, but do it quietly. The last thing Alabama needed was a public spectacle of a slave who had murdered white men and evaded justice. The hunt for Big Jacob, as he came to be called, was conducted with as much secrecy as possible. Rewards were posted in courthouses, but not in newspapers. Descriptions were circulated among sheriffs and slave patrols, but not published for the general public. Plantation owners across central Alabama began taking precautions, locking their bedroom doors, keeping loaded pistols on their nightstands, having trusted house slaves stand guard outside their rooms at night. None of it mattered. The winter of 1847 was one of the coldest in memory. Work slowed to a crawl. Slaves huddled in their unheated cabins, burning what little wood they could find. In the main houses, white families drew closer to their fireplaces and wondered if the silent killer was out there in the frozen darkness. 3 months passed without another death. Sheriff Braddock began to hope Jacob had either fled the state or died in the wilderness. But then, on February 9, 1848, a planter named Josiah Grantham was found dead in his bed at Elmwood Plantation. Same crushed throat, same locked door, same cotton bowls arranged around his head. Grantham had owned 112 slaves, and among them, according to his most recent property ledger, was a field hand acquired just 6 weeks earlier in a private sale. The seller's name was E. Reinhardt, one of Thaddeus Reinhardt's sons. The slave's name was Jacob. The pattern was now undeniable. Jacob was not fleeing. He was circulating. He was allowing himself to be sold from one plantation to another, and each time he killed his new owner before disappearing and arranging to be sold again. How he managed the logistics, how he communicated, how he ensured he ended up at specific plantations remained a mystery, but the fact was irrefutable. What Braddock could not understand was the method. How was Jacob entering locked rooms? How was he killing these men without waking them, without causing them to struggle or cry out? And most importantly, why was he doing this? The answer to that last question would come from an unexpected source, an elderly enslaved woman named Bethany, known as a healer and a keeper of stories. She had been born in Africa, brought to South Carolina as a young girl. When word of the killings reached Perry County, Bethany asked to speak with the local sheriff. She told him she had known a boy matching Jacob's description 40 years earlier in South Carolina. His mother had been brought from West Africa, his father the white overseer Samuel Colton. The boy, called Jacob, had been mute from birth, but he was not deaf and not stupid. He learned early that his silence made him invisible to white people. When Jacob was 10, his mother died under suspicious circumstances. 3 days later, Samuel Colton was found dead in his bed, his throat crushed. The boy was sold away immediately. Bethany lost track of him, but heard rumors over the years. A mute slave who moved from plantation to plantation, always arriving before tragedy struck. Sheriff Braddock listened with growing horror. If she was right, Jacob was not acting randomly. He was targeting specific men, planters, overseers, men who held power over the enslaved, men who, in Jacob's eyes, deserved to die. But that still didn't explain the how. The answer came from a 7-year-old boy, Thomas Grantham, son of the recently murdered Josiah Grantham. Thomas had nightmares of shadows moving in the dark, of something vast and silent standing over his bed. One evening, he told his mother he'd seen the giant slave Jacob standing in the hallway outside his father's bedroom the night of the murder. But Jacob hadn't been walking. He'd been crawling along the ceiling. His mother dismissed it as a child's fantasy, but mentioned it to the sheriff. Braddock took it seriously. He examined the hallway and saw something he'd missed: marks on the ceiling beams, subtle indentations, as if something very heavy had pressed against them. The marks led from the servants' staircase to Grantham's bedroom door. Braddock realized that a man of Jacob's height and reach could, In theory, brace himself between the walls of the narrow servants' staircase and climb upward without touching the steps. Once at the top, he could move along the hallway ceiling, hands and feet braced against opposite walls, body suspended above the floor. The strength required would be inhuman, but Jacob was not a normal man. If he could move along the ceiling, he could position himself above a closed door, wait for hours, and when the door opened, drop down like a spider, crushing his victim's throat before they could scream, then stage the scene. The locked door was meaningless. Jacob had never needed to open it. He had been inside the room the entire time, waiting above the door frame where no one thought to look. Just when you think this story can't get darker, consider this: if Jacob could move unseen through the most secure parts of these plantation houses, how many times had he watched these families sleep? How many nights had he spent suspended above their beds, deciding who would die and who would live? The horror was not just in the deaths, but in the realization that Big Jacob could have killed anyone at any time, and no locked door or armed guard could have stopped him. Sheriff Braddock's theory about Jacob's method was shared with a select group of lawmen and plantation owners. The reaction was skepticism mixed with terror. Skepticism because the physical capabilities required seemed beyond belief. Terror because if Braddock was right, every plantation house in Alabama was vulnerable. Precautions were taken. Ceilings were examined for marks. Hallways were patrolled at night. Some owners had extra locks installed or sealed the gaps between door and frame. But the precautions were ineffective because they misunderstood Jacob's pattern. Owners assumed he would strike quickly after being purchased, but Jacob had learned patience. His next victim, William Sturdivant of Wilcox County, owned Jacob for 4 months before dying in his bed on June 12, 1848. Sturdivant had taken every precaution. He had his hallway ceiling examined weekly, kept 2 loaded pistols within reach, had his most trusted house slave sleep outside his door. None of it mattered. On the morning of June 13, Sturdivant was found dead in his locked bedroom. The cotton bowls were arranged around his head, his tongue severed and placed in his hand. Fresh marks were found on the ceiling. The death of William Sturdivant marked a turning point. Up until then, there had been hope Jacob might be captured or killed. Now it was clear that conventional methods would not work. Jacob was not just physically formidable, he was intelligent, patient, and utterly committed to his mission. The governor authorized a special patrol, led by a professional bounty hunter named Marcus Pettigrew. The bounty for Jacob, dead or alive, was raised to 1,000. Pettigrew was a hard man known for his cruelty, but the planters didn't care. He began his hunt by studying every detail of Jacob's movements, tracing his route, interviewing dozens who had encountered him. What emerged was a picture of a man not acting randomly, but following a deliberate pattern. Every man Jacob had killed was a wealthy plantation owner, known for harshness, and many had personal connections to each other. Business partnerships, family ties, shared investments in slave trading. One name kept appearing: Samuel Colton, the overseer who had died in South Carolina 40 years earlier. Pettigrew realized that if he wanted to catch Jacob, he needed to think like him. He obtained records from slave trading firms, cross-referenced them with current plantation owners, and came up with a list of 11 names. 8 were already dead. The remaining 3 were Nathaniel Harwick, Isaiah Drummond, and Preston Dean. All 3 were warned and placed under protection. Pettigrew divided his patrol into 3 groups, one for each potential victim. For 6 weeks nothing happened. Then on August 2, 1848, Nathaniel Harwick was found dead in his bed. Crushed throat, locked door, cotton bowls, tongue severed and placed in both hands. The patrol assigned to protect Harwick had been stationed outside all night. They swore no one had entered or left. They had checked every door and window, yet Jacob had killed him anyway. The realization hit Pettigrew. Jacob had been inside the house before the patrol arrived, waiting somewhere in the structure, possibly for days. He had the patience to remain hidden and motionless as long as necessary, and he knew these houses better than the white families who lived in them. How could he know them so well? The answer came from a plantation ledger. Jacob had been living at Harwick's plantation for 6 weeks, working in the fields, sleeping in the quarters, waiting for his moment. When the patrol arrived, Jacob simply hid in the main house and waited for vigilance to waver. Jacob was not a fugitive, running from plantation to plantation. He was allowing himself to be sold, moving through the system that had enslaved him, using it against itself. He was invisible because he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Working in the fields, living in the quarters, performing the labor expected of him. When the time came, he used the access his status gave him. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The death of Harwick sent shockwaves through Alabama's planter class. The realization that armed guards and locked doors provided no protection, that Jacob could be living and working on their own plantations without their knowledge, created a paranoia that verged on hysteria. Plantation owners scrutinized their slave populations with new suspicion. Any unusually tall slave, any who seemed too quiet or too observant, any recently purchased, became a subject of intense scrutiny. Several slaves who fit Jacob's general description were arrested and interrogated, but none proved to be the man Pettigrew was hunting. Isaiah Drummond took the most extreme precautions. He had every slave examined by a physician, fired all his overseers, hired new men from out of state, and moved out of his plantation house, taking up residence in a hotel and visiting his property only during daylight hours. Preston Dane announced he was selling his entire slave population and leaving Alabama. The estate sale was scheduled for September 15, 1848. Among the slaves to be sold was a field hand named Jacob, purchased 8 months earlier from the estate of William Sturdivant. Pettigrew arrived at Dean's plantation on September 10 with his patrol. They found Jacob working in the fields. When the patrol approached, Jacob straightened and regarded them with those pale grey eyes, his expression blank. Pettigrew had brought heavy iron shackles, but when his men tried to chain Jacob, he did not resist. He simply stood still and allowed them to approach. But as the first man reached out, Jacob smiled. It was not a natural expression. His lips pulled back from his teeth as if he'd learned the mechanics of smiling from observation, but had never truly felt the emotion. In that smile, Pettigrew saw something that chilled him more than any crime scene. Jacob wanted to be captured. This was part of his plan. Jacob was chained to a post in the stable yard under constant guard. For 3 days, he stood there not eating, not drinking, not sleeping. Or if he did, he slept with his eyes open. On the 3rd night, one of the guards reported seeing Jacob's chains begin to glow faintly red, as if the metal was heating from within. By the time Pettigrew arrived, the glow had faded, but the iron was warm to the touch and the links near Jacob's wrists showed hairline fractures. The chains were replaced with even heavier ones, and the guard was doubled. The next morning, Pettigrew decided Jacob would be hanged at dawn, right there in the stable, and his body buried in an unmarked grave. That night, Dane retired to his bedroom, refusing guards inside the house. Jacob was chained and under constant observation in the stable yard, more than 100 yards from the main house. There was no possible way he could pose a threat. Dean locked his door, loaded his pistol, and slept soundly. He woke in the night to the sensation of pressure on his chest. In the darkness, he couldn't immediately identify what was causing it. He reached for his pistol, but it was out of reach. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw what was pinning him to the bed. Jacob's face hung directly above his own, so close Dean could feel the warmth of his breath. Those pale grey eyes reflected the moonlight, giving them an almost luminous quality. Jacob's hands, massive and impossibly strong, were wrapped around Dean's throat. Dean tried to scream, but no sound emerged. He tried to struggle, but Jacob's weight was immovable. The last thing Dean saw was Jacob's smile, widening as the pressure increased. In the stable yard, the guards maintained their watch. Jacob stood exactly as he had for the past 4 days, his eyes open, his posture unchanged. At dawn, when Pettigrew arrived to oversee the execution, he found his guards still at their posts, still watching Jacob. But when he approached the house, he found chaos. Preston Dean was dead in his locked bedroom. His throat was crushed, 7 cotton balls arranged around his head, his tongue severed and placed in both hands. The discovery of Dean's body while Jacob remained under constant observation created a crisis. If Jacob had not killed Dean, and the guards were certain he could not have, then who had? And if Jacob was not responsible for this murder, was he responsible for the others? Pettigrew, standing in Dean's bedroom, realized everything he thought he knew was wrong. Jacob had not killed Dean. Jacob had not killed any of them, at least not directly. But Jacob was central to what was happening. He returned to the stable and spoke to Jacob. "You didn't do it," Pettigrew said quietly. "You couldn't have. But you know who did. You know how this is happening." Jacob's expression didn't change. Pettigrew tried again. "You're not working alone. How many?" Jacob slowly raised his manacled hands and held up 9 fingers. 9, the number of plantation owners who had died, but also Pettigrew realized, possibly the number of people working with Jacob. They were all at Dean's sale. Pettigrew said, "The pieces falling into place. The buyers who came to examine the slaves. They were your people. And one of them killed Dean while you made sure all eyes were on you." Jacob lowered his hands, but his smile widened just a fraction. Pettigrew ordered everyone who had attended the estate sale viewing in the past week to be rounded up. By late afternoon, 47 people were assembled in the stable yard. Planters, slave traders, agents. Pettigrew asked how many had brought personal slaves. 13 hands went up. The slaves were brought forward. Pettigrew walked down the line, looking for something specific. The 10th man was shorter than Jacob, but when Pettigrew looked into his eyes he saw the same pale grey colour. On the man's left shoulder was a brand SC, the initials of Samuel Colton. "You were one of Colton's slaves," Pettigrew said, "and you survived. How many others survived?" The man said nothing, but his eyes moved toward Jacob. Pettigrew realized Jacob had not been working alone. He had coordinated a network of slaves across multiple states, all connected by their shared history with Colton. They had been passing information, arranging sales, positioning themselves on plantations where Colton's former associates now lived. While Jacob drew attention with his size and silence, the others, people like Samuel, who looked ordinary and could speak, did the actual killing. Pettigrew's men found 6 more among the 13 personal attendants who bore Colton's brand or other signs of connection. That made 7. Jacob had held up 9 fingers. The other 2, Pettigrew realized, were still out there. The interrogations began, but none of the suspects would speak. Jacob, still chained to his post, watched with that same faint smile. He had accomplished what he intended. He had exposed the network. He had forced Alabama's white population to confront the fact that enslaved people could organize, coordinate, and execute a campaign of targeted killings right under their masters' noses. The terror this revelation caused was in many ways more destructive than the murders themselves. A heated debate took place among Pettigrew, Sheriff Braddock, and the governor's representatives. What should be done with Jacob and his network? The obvious answer was execution, but several argued against it. A public execution would require a public explanation, revealing how sophisticated and far-reaching Jacob's network had been. It would show that enslaved people had successfully killed 9 prominent white men over 18 months without being detected. The psychological impact could be devastating, inspiring others to organize. After hours of argument, a decision was made. Jacob and the 7 identified members would be executed quietly, without public announcement. The official story would be that they died of disease. The remaining 2 would be hunted down and eliminated in the same manner. The murders would be attributed to natural causes or unknown assailants. The name Jacob would be erased from official records. The executions took place on September 16, 1848, in a clearing 5 miles from Dean's plantation. Jacob and the others were hanged in sequence, their bodies buried in a mass grave. According to the official report, Jacob maintained his silence to the end. He did not struggle as the noose was placed around his neck. He simply stood on the platform, his pale grey eyes scanning the faces of the men who had gathered to watch him die, and he smiled that same unsettling smile. Then the platform dropped, and Big Jacob was no more. The hunt for the remaining 2 members continued for years. One was found and hanged quietly, the 9th was never found. The official records were quietly altered. Death certificates were amended, estate records modified, newspaper archives physically changed. The conspiracy of silence was effective. Within a decade, the story of Big Jacob had faded from public consciousness, but the story survived in the enslaved community, passed down through generations, transformed and embellished, but retaining certain core elements: a giant man who could not speak, a network of people who coordinated to strike back, a campaign of justice that the authorities could neither prevent nor fully understand. Some versions claimed Jacob had supernatural powers, that he could pass through walls or become invisible. Others said he had never been caught, that the execution was staged and he escaped north. Still others maintained he was one of many, and the network continued long after his death. The truth, as best as it can be reconstructed, is both simpler and more remarkable. Jacob, or Jacob, was born into slavery around 1890 in South Carolina. His mother was a woman of extraordinary height, brought from West Africa. His father was Samuel Colton, the white overseer. Jacob's muteness was likely congenital, but his inability to speak became his greatest asset. White people talked freely in front of him, assuming he was less intelligent, less capable, less human. This allowed him to learn things most enslaved children never discovered. When his mother died, almost certainly murdered by Colton, Jacob killed the overseer using a method he would perfect over the years, hiding in the ceiling space, waiting for his victim to sleep, then dropping down and crushing the windpipe before a sound could be made. The 10-year-old was sold away immediately, and spent the next 30 years moving through the slave system, learning its mechanics, identifying the men most deeply involved in its brutality, and finding others like himself willing to risk everything for revenge. The network Jacob built was remarkable for its patience and sophistication. Its members did not act impulsively. They identified specific individuals who had participated in specific atrocities and eliminated them with careful planning. The decision to use Jacob as the visible element, to allow him to be sold from plantation to plantation, drawing attention to himself while others did the actual killing, was a strategy born of necessity. The cotton bolls and severed tongues were not random. They were messages, though their precise meaning is lost to time. Some say the cotton represented the crop that sustained the system, the tongues the stolen voices of millions forced into silence. Jacob's campaign succeeded in its immediate objective. 9 men who had profited from Colton's activities died as a result of his network. Several others fled Alabama, selling their slaves and abandoning their plantations out of fear. The economic impact was significant, but the longer-term impact was more subtle. The story of Big Jacob became part of the underground narrative of resistance. It showed that the system could be penetrated, that careful planning could overcome even the most secure defenses, that justice was possible even for those stripped of all rights. In the years leading up to the Civil War, there were other incidents in Alabama and surrounding states that bore similarities to Jacob's methods. These incidents were never officially connected to his network, and it's impossible to know whether they were the work of surviving members or simply inspired by the legend. What is known is that Marcus Pettigrew, the bounty hunter who orchestrated Jacob's capture, never worked as a slave catcher again. He returned to Tennessee and lived quietly until his death. In his later years, he sometimes woke in the night, claiming he could feel eyes watching him from the ceiling above his bed. The plantation houses where the murders took place still stand, in various states of preservation. Sweet Gum Plantation is now a bed and breakfast that makes no mention of its history. Elmwood Plantation is maintained as a historic site, though guides avoid discussing the events of 1848. In none of these places will you find any official acknowledgement of Big Jacob or his network. The historical plaques, the museum displays, the carefully curated narratives of the Old South, all omit this chapter. It is as if the conspiracy of silence that began in 1848 continues to this day, but the story persists in oral tradition, in the family histories, in the fragments that survive the attempted erasure. Every now and then, researchers digging through old records find anomalies, names crossed out, death certificates altered, references to unexplained events. These fragments are all that remain of a story Alabama's establishment desperately wanted to forget, the story of a man who could not speak, but found a way to make his voice heard, who was treated as property, but refused to be owned, who was considered less than human, but proved himself more thoughtful, more strategic, and more dangerous than any of the men who claimed to be his masters. This mystery reminds us that the history we think we know is often incomplete, that the official records tell only part of the story, and that the most significant acts of resistance are sometimes the ones most thoroughly suppressed. What do you think? Was everything truly revealed? Could there be more to Jacob's network than was ever discovered? If this story gave you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. And remember, sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that were never meant to be told.